Now, tennis superstar Novak Djokovic has won his match with the Australian government over his COVID vaccination status. He was denied entry into the country because he wouldn't disclose if he'd had the vaccine. His argument was he didn't need to say, as he had contracted COVID-19 and therefore had acquired natural immunity. Australian medical specialists and the court agreed with him. Of course, the matter may still be appealed by the government, but let's focus on what this issue means for the vaccine mandate and exemptions globally and here at home. I'm joined by public health lawyer Safura Abdool Karim. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. First of all, what do you make of the Novak Djokovic matter? First of all, from a medical point of view, did the court, in your view, make the right decision that immunity, whether acquired through a vaccination or natural infection, is immunity nonetheless?
So I think when we look at the court's decision, we do see a reliance on more technical grounds rather than on the substantive issue of whether or not natural immunity should be a basis for a medical exemption. The case really seems to have turned on how much time Djokovic was given to remedy the situation. In other words, he arrived and he was on the wrong visa, etc. And he wasn't given an opportunity to consult with lawyers, and he wasn't given an opportunity to sort of address the shortfall in the visa. And that's really sort of, it seems, the procedural areas on which the decision turned. So that question of whether or not this natural immunity is a basis for a medical exemption is actually still open, and it is actually open to the Australian Minister of the equivalent of Foreign Affairs to determine whether or not to cancel the visa. He has a second bite at the cherry, so to speak.
I think it really makes the point, as you're saying, this was a technical issue perhaps, and the medical case has perhaps not been made. There is significant grey area, and it seems differing approaches between various countries and global bodies, even businesses, around vaccine mandates and how we apply them and the exemptions we give. Are we going to see more of this type of confusion, mismatch and possible court cases, do you think?
Undoubtedly. We're aware in South Africa of at least a dozen cases currently sitting with the CCMA on the issue of whether or not somebody can be forced to take a vaccine due to a workplace mandate. It is interesting, this case, because a lot of the policies that I've reviewed haven't considered natural immunity as a basis for a medical exemption. Most of the medical exemptions have been around people who are immunocompromised or have a history of allergies and are unable to take a vaccine. So thinking about whether natural immunity is a basis to refuse vaccination isn't something that I've seen existing mandates consider, particularly in South Africa. Of course, the confusion remains compounded because in South Africa, every workplace is adopting their own policy, and we don't have an overarching approach the way that other places like New York and Israel do, where even though it's being imposed on private actors, the standards are set by the government. So it's really important to address this confusion, that the South African government consider what our approach should be nationally to try and avoid this confusion being exacerbated further.
Of course, the Novak Djokovic issue has become quite a rallying cry for those opposed to vaccinations, COVID vaccinations in general, and the vaccine mandates in particular. What do you make of the legal and human rights aspect of this issue? Because that's always cited, that my individual rights are being violated, for example.
So what we've seen during COVID-19, from the courts at least, is a remarkable willingness to permit quite drastic incursions on individual freedoms. If you think back to what the lockdowns were like initially, we saw people's freedom of movement being restricted, their ability to trade and work being restricted, their ability to purchase different things or access certain services being severely restricted. And all of those restrictions on individual liberties and rights were considered justifiable by the courts in the interest of preserving life and protecting the rights to life and the rights to health that are also enshrined in the Constitution. We don't know whether that same logic will apply to something like a vaccine mandate, because arguably a vaccine mandate is asking somebody to do something as opposed to refrain from doing something. And it is a more permanent and more invasive form of limiting individual rights. So, those cases provide a guideline to say that, yes, there are competing interests here, but how it will actually turn out in these decisions, we're going to have to wait for the courts to give us that view. you.
And also, I would imagine, surely, that the goalposts are constantly moving. For example, you might be able to argue that now that we have proof that the Omicron variant is not as serious, say, as Delta, that you have even less grounds to argue for a vaccine mandate.
I think that, what we have to remember is that exactly as you described it, the goalposts are constantly changing in this pandemic. And we also have to remember our underlying philosophy of Ubuntu, which is underpinned in the Constitution, it's underpinned in our general society, the idea that we are a community and we need to work to protect others. So yes, vaccine mandates may infringe individual liberties, but there are really compelling reasons why individuals, if they're going to be in high-risk situations, should be vaccinated if they wish to partake in those activities. I'm talking specifically about things like going to restaurants, attending sports matches, but also things like working in a healthcare facility where you pose a significant risk to others if you're not vaccinated. So I think also part of it is influenced by what the mandate looks like and who it's targeting and what types of activities.
You mentioned that there are at least a dozen cases already in court in South Africa over some workplaces mandating vaccines, or at least asking people to have a vaccination to avoid ongoing testing. So talk to me about the rules here in South Africa. What is considered a valid medical exemption from getting the COVID-19 vaccine?
So, as I mentioned, each workplace has decided what basis for exemptions they're going to allow. So the ones that I've looked at have varied considerably. Some have allowed not just medical exemptions, but exemptions on the basis of freedom of religion or even philosophical or political thoughts. That would include, anti-vaxxer beliefs. Whereas others, like we can think about the discovery mandate, for example, are looking more at that really narrow class of exemptions where somebody cannot take a vaccine for health reasons, as opposed to not needing a vaccine because they have, for example, natural immunity. I haven't seen any policies that contemplate Djokovic's argument, that natural immunity should result in an exemption. It really has been quite narrow so far. This case does open up the question of whether we should be considering an exemption on those grounds.
And of course, here in South Africa, we know that some universities and workplaces, they're putting those policies in place. So as we go forward into 2022, bearing in mind that everything is shifting, what do you think the critical issues are that need to be kept front and center to make sure that individual rights are not infringed upon?
So I think there are two key things. The one is we need consistency. We need a benchmark that says this is the standard to which everyone is going to be held. Because at the moment, depending on where you work, you can be subject to entirely different constraints and entirely different mandates. And that's not a tenable position. People need certainty, and the government needs to step in and create a level playing field where people know, in order to do these things, this is how I have to comply. The second thing that I think we need to recognize is that vaccine mandates are not in and of themselves a solution. We have seen across other countries that have chosen to implement them that they work in the short term. They do cause an uptick in vaccine uptake. But we also need to address the underlying reasons why people are not getting vaccinated. And that includes things like difficulties in accessing healthcare, the high opportunity cost of taking time off work to go and get vaccinated, etc. So we need a much stronger push from government to ensure that they are coupling mandates with other types of public health interventions to promote vaccine uptake in South Africa. Because at the end of the day, this is about reducing the risk of transmission, reducing the risk of severe COVID, and ultimately protecting people's health.
All right. Well, thank you so much for providing such clarity in a very difficult and convoluted issue. Much appreciate your time. And that, of course, is public health lawyer Safura Abdool Karim. Now, let's